Good afternoon. Thank you guys for joining us for another installment of Reasonable Faith. This is our monthly book study. We've been going through this lovely easy read. I don't know if you can see it because my filter is doing a background blur effect, but this is the Blackwell Companion. There we go. There we go. You can see it on their screens. The Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology. And we have been going chapter by chapter, and you guys have joined us for these amazing speakers. This month is no different, but it is the first month where we have a husband and wife duo joining us. We have Timothy and Lydia Mcgrew joining us to talk about their chapter on an argument for miracles. Lydia Mcgrew is a widely published analytical philosopher, and she's the author of several books on the New Testament. Her husband, Tim, is a full professor of philosophy at Western Michigan University, and they have so graced us with their presence. So without any further ado, I'm John. I am the director of Southern Colorado. Charles, our regional for the Western United States, is here with us again. He's like my what are we, Charles? We're like Bonnie and Clyde.
Dynamic duo,
Batman and Robin, both Batman. So then we'll turn it over to you, Tim, if you're ready to take us away.
Sure. Well, thanks for having us, John and Charles. Thank you for setting this up. It's a pleasure to be with you guys today. This is a topic that never grows old. So what we're going to do is split the time that your presenters would normally take. I will take you on a very brief and non-technical tour of where we go in our article. And then I will turn it over to Lydia. Lydia will tell you where our research has taken us since that time, a few places where we would now restate something a little bit differently that we had stated in the article, and some research that we have done that substantiates some things that we took for granted when we wrote the article, and we were very explicit about that. And then we'll fling it open for questions, and you guys can hit us with your best shot. So I'm going to share a screen here briefly. There we go. So I am calling this the case for the resurrection, a maximal data approach. You may have heard of something called a minimal facts approach. Our approach is not a minimal facts approach. Our approach is something different. And so I will give you just an outline of that today. I thought that it would be a good idea if I broke down the way that our thinking goes here in a way that enables you to see it in a diagram. So I'm going to start with this question. Do the Gospels give a faithful account of what original witnesses of the life of Jesus said about him? You can say no, maybe because with a fair number of contemporary biblical scholars, you think that they are late and or legendary, or you can say yes. In our article, we took it as given, because you can only do so much even when you've got 70 pages to fill, that the Gospels give us an account that is as faithful as we would expect from an ordinary historical report, at least when they're reporting things that are not miraculous. So something like Tacitus or Josephus recording contemporaneous events. And so we didn't deal in the article with the negative answer to this question. We just took that as read. Later, we have done quite a bit more work on that. So you'll see the kind of work that we have done as we go forward. So you can say, if they are faithful accounts, you can ask the question, are they true? And the answer might be that they are not true, or that they are. If they are, we're done. The great historical claims of Christianity are true, and we were making an argument for the resurrection. There is more to be done in an argument for Christianity than merely arguing for the resurrection. We want to argue that we know, for example, what Jesus taught. We want to be able to see his doctrine as well as his bodily resurrection. But if the accounts are faithful accounts of what the original witnesses said and they are true, they give us a good deal of that as well. So I just want to make that distinction between giving an argument for the resurrection and giving an argument for Christianity. The resurrection is a major step on the way. But if you got to it by some route that circumvented the Gospels, you would still have the question, what did Jesus actually say? And that could become awkward if in the course of making your argument for the resurrection, you had given away the farm on the reliability of the Gospels. We do not intend to do that. That's why our approach is a more maximal approach. But the other branch of this breakdown says, no, the accounts are not true. And in that case, the question is, did the witnesses know that they were untrue? Did they know that what they were saying wasn't true? And here, again, the way splits. If they didn't know, then they were either deceived or honestly mistaken. They somehow got the idea that these things were true, but they were wrong about it. If they did know that they were untrue and they said them anyway, then they were deliberate deceivers. So those options give us a complete breakdown of the logical possibilities. Either they are not faithful accounts of what the original witnesses said, or they are. If they are, either they're false or they're true. If they're false, either the witnesses didn't know that they were false or they did. When you have a complete breakdown of the possibilities of this kind, then you can go about considering the options. As I said, we left out of account the first one because you've got to start somewhere and the article was already long enough. But we are very interested in the remaining three, which are the bottom nodes on this chart here, that they were deceived, that they were deceivers, or that the claims were in fact true. So here's how the maximal data approach works, just in the barest outline. We argue that the context of the claims of the earliest witnesses makes it extremely unlikely that they were deliberate deceivers. The original witnesses, or those who profess to be original witnesses of the Christian miracles, passed their lives in labors, dangers, and sufferings voluntarily undertaken in attestation of the accounts that they delivered, and so far as one can tell, solely because they believed those accounts. And they also submitted from the same motives to new rules of conduct. It's very unlikely that they, especially as they were all devout Jews, that they would have done this unless they were not deliberate deceivers. The content of their claims makes it extremely unlikely that they were deceived or honestly mistaken. This claim, especially the resurrection, is a very difficult claim to be mistaken about. It is not something that requires a medical degree to tell the difference between a living man and a dead man. It is not something that requires some kind of training in forensic detection to tell whether someone is or is not your intimate friend with whom you've been spending life day in and day out for the past 3 years. So the content makes it hard for them to have been deceived or honestly mistaken. The context of the claims makes it unlikely that they were deliberate deceivers. And those are the two possibilities if the accounts delivered what the witnesses said were untrue. When you have a partition, as we like to call it in probability theory, when you have a mutually exclusive, jointly exhaustive set of options, and you can show that two parts of that have a very low probability, the probability goes over to the remaining part. And so that is what we were trying to do in going through the article. The strategy that we employed was to bring forward facts that would be more strongly expected if the resurrection, we call that R in the article, actually took place than if it did not. The little squiggle in front of the R there under "it did not" is read not R. That's a negation sign in logic. Don't worry, this is as far into the symbolism as we're going to go today. If you are very interested in the technical details, we can go as far as you like into that, but we thought that for a general presentation, you probably would prefer the overview method. The ratio of those expectations, how strongly it's expected if the resurrection took place, how strongly it's expected if it did not take place, that ratio as a division problem, one thing above the other, is the measure of the force of that piece of evidence in favor of R. And there's a whole technical literature on why that's a desirable way of measuring the force of a piece of evidence. More interesting even than that is that when there are multiple pieces of independent evidence all favoring R, their force is not just added, it's multiplied. So just to give a quick example, suppose that we have 4 pieces of evidence. I said 5 here. I'm not sure why I have that on the slide. 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 4 to 1, and 5 to 1. You multiply all those together, and that's 2 times 3 times 4 times 5 to 1 is 120 to 1. That is a very significant body of evidence, but no single piece of that evidence is all that strong by itself. So this is the strategy we pursue. And we argue that there are multiple independent pieces of evidence favoring R. And in particular, some of the pieces of evidence that we break out, we argue actually are composite, and they're composed of quite a few. So let's get on to that now briefly. We've got the testimony of the women, the testimony of the disciples, and the conversion of Paul as three major categories of evidence that we talk about in the article. The testimony of the women is interesting because this is not a story that you would make up if you were freely inventing a story with the hope of composing a persuasive propaganda narrative. We cite multiple pieces of evidence that the testimony of women was not generally taken to be worth as much as the testimony of men. And if you're freely inventing these things rather than reporting what actually happened, you would be motivated to make the strongest case you can. Even in the 2nd century, the skeptic Celsus argues that the fact that the reports were first made by hysterical women is a weakness of the case. He goes straight for that. This would be, as N.T. Wright says, like shooting yourself in the foot if you were trying to make this up. But to the historian, this is gold dust. So we give a factor for the testimony of the women, and I think we probably actually could break that down in a different way and increase that factor, but I'll let Lydia talk about that more when I turn it over to her. Next, the testimony of the disciples. This is a really interesting one because we have quite a few disciples. We have the 12 minus 1, Judas obviously not counting. Then we've got the one that was brought in Acts chapter 1, Matthias, as a replacement for Judas. And then James, the brother of Jesus, was not one of the original disciples, but by the middle of the book of Acts, we see him as a leader in Jerusalem. So we have multiple people who, again, devoted their lives and endured labors and dangers and sufferings, and they could have known that they were going to endure them voluntarily in attestation of the central claim, which you see everywhere in Acts. Look at the sermons in Acts. What is at the heart of their proclamation? Jesus was raised from the dead by the power of God in attestation of his divine mission and his teaching, and this is what they are proclaiming. He was, in fact, the Messiah promised by the prophets, and we are witnesses of this, and he appeared to us after his death. So the testimony of the disciples is not just one testimony, it's a bunch of them. And we give an argument, and we would finesse this now, but we give an argument that actually the testimony of the disciples is, if anything, likely to be negatively correlated. That's a technical term. What it means is we may actually be underestimating the force of the testimony simply by multiplying them. So that's a little technical twist on it there. Third point, the conversion of Paul. Here is a man who knew the arguments that had convinced an Ananias that Christianity was a deception of the people. He was certainly not somebody who would be easily sold on this new way that was sweeping across Palestine. He was a violent persecutor. I like to say that the conversion of Paul is as unexpected as it would have been if Osama bin Laden had suddenly become Amish. It's just not what you would expect. The conversion of Paul is something quite independent of the fact that women were the first testifiers to the empty tomb, or the fact that the disciples all were willing to endure labors and dangers and sufferings for their position, because Paul was outside of those groups. So the conversion of Paul is a piece of evidence by itself. There's a technical point that we make in the article that I'm going to try to state non-technically, and then you can ask questions about it when we move on to the Q&A. And that is this. When we're considering these ratios, when we're considering how strongly we would expect each of these facts, if the resurrection were true and if the resurrection were false, we are comparing them to the entire space of non-resurrection possibilities. So we've got the resurrection and the resurrection was false. We are not comparing the probability, the expectation of the testimony of women to some sub-hypothesis of not R that's been ginned up just to produce a favorable ratio for, or a favorable numerical value for the expectation of that, given that the resurrection didn't appear. You can always rummage around and gerrymander, scotch tape together some sub-hypothesis that will give you a high probability of any specific piece of evidence. The price you pay for that is exactly that your ad hoc version of it ends up occupying a vanishingly small slice of the probability space under not R. What that means is illustrated by something that we have in philosophy in the work of René Descartes. Descartes considers the possibility of an evil deceiver making all of your experiences look the way that they now look. And hey, I mean, if that hypothesis is true, then your experience would be pretty much what it is. But there's not the slightest reason to suppose that there is such a deceiver, or that if there were, he'd be interested in deceiving you, or that if he were, he'd be able to do it perfectly so you couldn't see any flaws in it. It's just a hypothesis, the only merit of which is that it's been gerrymandered to give you exactly the data you have, which is why instinctively non-philosophers don't take it very seriously, and neither do some philosophers. So that's the outline of the core of the article. We think in terms of mutually exclusive, jointly exhaustive categories. We take something for granted in order to get the argument out on the table. Then we approach it in terms of pieces of evidence, each piece of the evidence being more strongly expected if Jesus rose from the dead than if he did not. And when we have multiple independent pieces of evidence, we multiply them together. And when we get to specifics, we drew out evidence from 3 different categories like this, in each case comparing the expectation if Jesus rose to the expectation if he did not. I'll say one more thing here that some people have found useful from our presentation, because I think this is a point that's easy to overlook. The most likely thing to happen if Jesus didn't rise from the dead is nothing. When the Bar Kokhba rebellion, a couple of generations later, was brutally crushed by the Romans, what happened after Bar Kokhba was holed up in a cave somewhere around Mount Gerizim and his body wasn't even found? What happened is that nobody wanted to admit that they'd even known him. The whole thing just died off like that. Failed messiahs were not the core of vibrant, thriving movements that took over the Roman Empire within the span of a couple of centuries. This is not the way these things roll. So the most likely thing to have happened is, hey, Peter goes back to fishing and the disciples get on with their lives. They already have Judaism. They already have a whole system of ritual and sacrifice and prayer that puts them in contact with God. They had something even to fall back upon, but they didn't. They were persuaded that something else had happened. So the testimony and the transformation of the disciples is a really interesting point there. And it becomes more important when we realize that if the resurrection didn't happen, there isn't the slightest reason to suppose that they would go on propounding some new variant on Judaism, some extension of the franchise, as Paul puts it. That the most likely thing to happen is just nothing at all. That completes my brief run through the structure of our argument. And now I am going to stop. I'm going to hand the baton over to Lydia, and I'm going to let Lydia talk about where our thought has gone since we wrote this article, so that you can get a more up-to-date view of where we're coming from.
Cool. Thank you, Tim, and thank you, John and Charles, for having us. What I want to do is to link my presentation on where our thought has gone since then to Tim's, by going to something that you will notice when you read the article that we wrote for the Blackwell Companion. You will notice that when we are evaluating the testimony of the disciples and the extent to which it's expected if Jesus did and didn't rise from the dead, we emphasize the physical details of the accounts in the Gospels. We make a big deal about that. We say it's not well explained, for example, by a mere vision or by a hallucination. etc. Why? Because when the disciples testified, they said that Jesus was there with them, that they could touch him, that they ate with him on multiple occasions. In other words, what we're doing is we're actually using the details of the accounts that you find in the Gospels as part of our analysis. We're bringing that in. We're not ignoring that. We're not minimizing that. Now, we knew that that was important. We knew that we needed that in order to argue for a high Bayes factor, as we call it. That's that measure of the force of the evidence, and that the disciples were reasonable to think Jesus rose from the dead. Not just that they did think it, but that they were rational to think it. Because obviously, if you had those kinds of experiences that are described there, including Jesus inviting you to touch him, including the doubting Thomas sequence of events, then you would really reasonably think that this person was risen from the dead. But what we said in that article, which we came to understand was incorrect, was that it was granted by a large majority of scholars that the disciples did testify in this way, that the gospel accounts represented what the witnesses claimed. Now, obviously, skeptical scholars, liberal scholars are not going to grant that it is true, but we thought that they at least granted that this is what they said. And then we went on to examine what is the best explanation if this is indeed what they said, along the lines that Tim has already outlined. That statement that this is granted by a high majority of a wide variety of scholars was based upon a misunderstanding of the work of Gary Habermas. I've recently written a series of 3 blog posts. I wrote those in November of 2021 about how that misunderstanding came about and how that is actually bound up with a misunderstanding of the strength of the minimal facts account. We understood we weren't doing that, but we thought we could access at least the notion that, hey, the scholars at least grant that this is what they were claiming, and then we were going to go use those details. Once we realized that, in fact, no, many scholars, especially on the more liberal end of the spectrum, don't grant that at all. They think that these physical details, especially of the resurrection narratives, like Jesus being able to eat or the doubting Thomas episode, are later embellishments. They would go with that branch that Tim gave at the very beginning when he gave that branching account. And once we realized that, we said, oh, okay, well then, so much the worse for scholarly consensus. And we went about to argue that the Gospels are not that sort of embellished narrative. Tim argued this. He first brought to my attention an argument called the argument for undesigned coincidences, which is at the heart of my book, Hidden in Plain View. He also had an actual grant from the Templeton Foundation to study the history of the deist controversy. And in the course of that, he brought out some wonderful old books back to the attention of people in the modern era with arguments concerning the reliability of the Gospels. And then I've gone on and I've written other books answering certain ideas and certain challenges to that. So The Mirror or the Mask, and then The Eye of the Beholder, and bringing back in arguments from Paley, T.R. Burks, and even more recent scholars like Leon Morris and B.F. Westcott and J.B. Lightfoot and so forth, that the Gospels are not those kinds of embellished things where they're adding stuff to the resurrection narratives. In other words, defending what we had already made use of in the resurrection article, rather than, in a sense, punting to scholarly consensus. So that's an important change. So as you read through that article, if you see places where we say, oh, there's this wide agreement with scholars and so forth. Now, even there, it was interesting. We said concerning the testimony of the disciples, that is where we are going to have to most depend on the details of the text. And we said that already in the 2009 article. It's right there. You can find it. So, we realized that we needed to do that. we just didn't realize how much additional argument is a good idea to have. And once we realized that that was needed, we went out and we did that. And that has given rise to, additional books, my YouTube channel, and all kinds of things like that. Now, with that in place, that leads to another interesting thing concerning independence, where we went and we did that multiplied Bayes factor for the testimony of the disciples. A question can be raised about that. If you have a sufficiently gerrymandered explanation of the disciples' testimony, and it would have to be quite strange, then can you still do that to a power of 13? We were doing it to a power of 13. Or would your, whatever it might be, this strange hypothesis under not R, not come to just be the not R hypothesis after only, maybe 6 of those iterations of the testimony of the disciples? Now, in my professional work, since that time, I took an insight that Tim had, a technical insight about independence, and I've run with that. I've published a number of completely secular professional articles about independence, witness testimony, independence, and what are called sub-hypotheses under the negation of the main hypothesis, and how you do that. So that might mean that it's not quite so easy to simply multiply by, to a power of 13. However, now we can bring in what I've just said concerning additional research into the reliability of the Gospels, and what we were already allowing ourselves to use, which is the details of the account. That gives us additional sources of independence in the narratives that we did not attempt to exploit in the article already, that can be brought in to mitigate any lessening of that cumulative Bayes factor. So here are just a few of those. With the testimony of the women, we can probably beef up that Bayes factor by not lumping all of the women together. So, for example, Mary Magdalene and Joanna are both said to have been among those women, but they're not going to be under the same influences. Joanna's husband was Huzzah, Herod's household manager. If his wife were putting forward something that she didn't have good reason for, he would have had good reason to dissuade her. But he wouldn't be an influence upon Mary Magdalene, for example. So you have greater diversity there. Also, you have diversity of appearances. You have this within both the testimony of the women and the testimony of the men. So, for example, it seems that Mary Magdalene saw Jesus alone, but then the other group of women, including Salome, Joanna, the other Mary, as she's called, Luke lists several of these names, that they saw Jesus when they were together, but separately from Mary Magdalene. So that's 2 different accounts. So if this were some sort of hysteria, an imagination, a hallucination, a dream, whatever it might be, then it's happening to different groups of women. And they're giving you different circumstances. Mary Magdalene, while she's sad and weeping at the tomb, the other women, while they're running away with fear and joy from the tomb, and they're on the road. Similarly with the men, we have multiple different groupings of them. So on that first evening, it expressly says in John that Thomas was not with them. But then a week later, that Thomas was with them on a different occasion. We have in John 21 a specific group of 7. And they're not in the upper room. They're in Galilee, but it's not the time in Galilee that Matthew tells about. Rather, it's a time when they've been out fishing all night and haven't caught anything, and then they see Jesus on the shore, and he already has fish there prepared for them. That's another occasion when he eats with them. Whereas in Luke, it mentions his asking if they have any food but that's in Jerusalem on that first night to convince them that he's not a spirit, that he's not a ghost. So and then something we didn't make any use of is the story in Luke of Clopas and his companion on the road to Emmaus, yet another attestation of a detailed physical encounter with a conversation. It's not just Jesus showing up and saying, all is well, be faithful or something, and then he disappears. It's very detailed, and several of these are very detailed, but they're different. They're different from one another. At that point, trying to imagine a not our scenario that is going to give us an equal reason to expect all of these different things as Jesus' bodily physical resurrection gets harder and harder and harder. And this is where being able to take it that the Gospels give us what the disciples actually claimed is really important. What the original people who were in a position to know actually claimed is very important. And it gives us evidence for Jesus' bodily resurrection. On my YouTube channel recently, which I hope you'll all look up, it's just Lydia Mcgrew, and subscribe to, I've had the opportunity to study some accounts of what are called rainbow bodies in Buddhism in Tibet. And they're much more recent, so some people think that's impressive because, you have claims of this even in the 21st century, which is that certain Tibetan masters their bodies have completely disappeared and turned into rainbows, is the claim. I have been very struck by the paucity of evidence for those claims and their contrast to the claims for Jesus' resurrection and to the detail that we have. And so, for example, Dale Allison says, it was said that this one master appeared to many of his disciples, but when you go and you read it, it says that he appeared to them in dreams. And the closest that you even get to a claim is that one person, while he was by himself, believed that he felt this master plucking at his sleeve and saying, study hard and be diligent. I forget, there might have been three short lines, and that was it. That's all there was to it. And you contrast that with what these people were willing to die for, these far more detailed claims that they could not have been mistaken about. They would have known if they were false. So those are some changes and some additions to our arguments that we've made since then. And I hope that shows you how the maximal data case can be fleshed out, and what we were using already, and then what we've come to add since then. So at this point, I think we can, I'm going to take a really brief break. I'll be right back, but just go ahead and go straight to the question and answer.
Oh my gosh, that was so wonderful and lovely. For those of you who are joining us for this another monthly installment, the question, if we had to say, what's this whole talk about? The question is surrounding miracles, right? And are miracles things that we should pay attention? Are miracles important? Is it just one person's word versus another, or do miracles point to something greater? And ultimately, can miracles lead back to God? And Timothy and Lydia Mcgrew have done an amazing job outlining their thoughts. The work they're referring to, the book is called The Black World Companion to Natural Theology. It was released back in 2009, as Lydia said. Charles is holding up a copy to his screen. That is where you can find the article that we are discussing today. And as Lydia just shared about their recent research, in the YouTube chat below, you'll find links to her YouTube page and other things. So feel free to check those out. Tim, Dr. Mcgrew, I'm so tickled pink. As a data scientist, I had no idea that you guys were going to use a data approach. So I am just all kinds of giddy. And I have to say one additional piece as well. I think sometimes people ask the question, why do you guys do what you do? I mean, we already have the church. What's the reason for, reasonable faith and some of these other pieces? And one thing we try to help them understand about natural theology is that it really has two objectives. The first objective is it's trying to demonstrate the rational warrant for the Christian faith. So essentially, we're trying to ask, is it reasonable? Are the things that we talk about as Christians, are they reasonable things, or have we lost our marbles completely? The second thing we try to do, or the second thing that natural theology does, and I think Dr. Craig, who I'm sure you've shared spaces with many times, does really well, is it shows the intellectual price tag to hold an opposing view, right? So if someone was to say the miracles surrounding the resurrection, the testimony of the women, the testimony of the disciples, the conversion of Paul, that really is not something that I find convincing. Hopefully, if you are watching this presentation with an open mind and really considering the evidence, you'll begin to realize how tricky of a position that is, right? Because then, it's not easy enough to just say that's not convincing. You actually have to do the work to demonstrate why you believe that is. Okay, so let's transition over. Charles, if you would like to unmute, I'm throwing you on the spot because you're Batman, and give us the question from David. That would be good.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Tim and Lydia, for your presentation. I really appreciate it. We have a question from another Reasonable Faith chapter director. Give me a second while I pull this up.
I didn't realize this, Charles, but you kind of sound like Batman. I'm just going to keep on this for a little bit. I think it's entertaining.
I'm Batman.
Which one? Yeah.
Yeah, right. Okay. Hello, Dr. and Dr. Mcgrew. I'm very appreciative of your work in ministry. I just ordered my copy of Hidden in Plain View and looking forward to read it. I have a skeptical friend to whom I'm witnessing. He is seeking. He asks the following questions. Question 1. Based on what we know about Pontius Pilate's governing style and how he typically dealt with the people making treasonous statements like calling himself King of the Jews, especially during Passover, why would he give the body to Joseph of Arimathea instead of leaving it on the cross as a message to others who might create problems, especially with the latter being the typical way of dealing with it? That's the first question. And let me just put the second one out here real quick is how would Joseph of Arimathea even heard of Jesus, especially with Joseph being stationed in Jerusalem and Jesus never being in Jerusalem after he started his ministry? Appreciate your response in time.
Okay, let's start with the first one, because I think that there are some things that are loaded into the question that are simply false. First of all, would Pilate have taken Jesus' statement to be King of the Jews as a treasonous statement? Well, what do we have as records? We have the accounts in the Gospels. Let's first go to Luke and see what Luke has to say about that. What Luke says is that Pilate turned to Jesus and said, "Are you the King of the Jews?" And Jesus said, "Su leges." You said it. Whatever that means, it probably means, yeah, you said it yourself, but whatever it means, it certainly does not mean, no, who, me, there's been a terrible mistake. And what does Luke immediately say? Just beginning of Luke 23, Pilate went out and said, "I find no fault in this man." Now, that's really curious, because his making himself to be a king would seem at first blush to be the kind of thing that Caesar's representative, his regional governor, would have to take seriously. Go over to John chapter 18, and the exchange between Jesus and Pilate is given at greater length. Pilate says to him, are you a king? And Jesus says, "Are you saying this for yourself, or did somebody else put you up to asking the question?" And Pilate's a little bit nonplussed by that response. He says, "Your own people have delivered you up to me. What have you done?" And Jesus tells him, "My kingdom isn't of this world. If it were, my servants would fight. But that's not the kind of kingdom that it is. That's not where it's coming from." And Pilate then goes out and says, "I find no fault in this man." Why? Because Jesus is saying, I'm not a military leader. And what is the nearest thing Pilate's got? If he has studied some Plato, maybe he's thinking, oh, like a philosopher king, Jewish style or something. Okay, yeah, not a threat, not the kind of thing Caesar has to take seriously. So the first false presupposition embedded in the question is that Pilate would see this as a treasonous statement. We actually have a report of the dialogue that shows exactly why Pilate would not see it as a treasonous statement, but rather as just some kind of internecine Jewish thing that he doesn't have to take so seriously. Second thing, what about Pilate's way of dealing with these people. If you actually look at how Pilate tried to deal with the Jews, when it didn't interfere with his own personal plans, he tended to cater to them as much as he could. And when he didn't, he got his hands slapped by Rome. He is walking a very difficult tightrope between squeezing out of the people what, as a governor, he's supposed to, and trying to keep a fractious Jewish population from boiling over. These are the people who, according to Josephus, had actually gotten into a collective argument at Passover time back when Jesus was about 12 years old and killed some Roman guards. This is a population that you don't want to get riled up. You've got millions of them, or at least, if Josephus is exaggerating, hundreds of thousands of them coming every year into Jerusalem. This is a population you want to mollify, and Pilate often did try to mollify them. Now, they proved to be a really difficult bunch to handle, but look, it's nothing that interferes with his plans to say to them, okay, you don't want to leave a body up on the Sabbath day because that has to do with your own religious rituals, and you're supposed to be allowed to carry out your own religious rituals within the holy city. Go ahead. If somebody comes and asks him for the body, there is nothing out of character with Pilate in his saying, yeah, go ahead, do whatever you want. So the question is really loaded with false presuppositions. And when we go to Josephus and we read what Josephus has to say about the character of Pilate, when we go to the Gospel of John and we see the longer exchange between Jesus and Pilate, we find that there's nothing incongruous about this at all. So that's an answer to the first question. Now, the second question, if I recall here, Charles, is about Joseph of Arimathea, right? Was that the second part of that?
Yeah.
Lydia, why don't you go ahead and take that one?
Yeah, so that one's also a very loaded question. It starts with the presupposition that Jesus was never in Jerusalem after, from the beginning of his ministry onward. That ignores the entire Gospel of John, which refers to several occasions when he was in Jerusalem during his ministry. And it is, if it's depending on the synoptics, it's an argument from silence. Certainly the synoptics never say that. They just don't describe a ministry. In fact, there are a number of things that are well explained as kind of undesigned coincidences between John and the synoptics. And it was funny when Charles sent us this question earlier today, I read it and I said to Tim, oh, cool, a new undesigned coincidence that I hadn't thought of before, which is that in the synoptics, you find Joseph of Arimathea already knowledgeable about who Jesus is and having been a disciple, a secret disciple. And in John, you find that Jesus had in fact been in the Jerusalem area several times, which helps to explain Joseph of Arimathea's being aware of him. It fits together great. So it's just simply not true that Jesus hadn't been in Jerusalem. Previously. It's just that the synoptics tend to emphasize his Galilean ministry. And there are other coincidences like that. So, for example, Bartimaeus, as he's named, the blind beggar, and his companion in Jericho already know that Jesus is a miracle worker. And so when they hear that he's passing by, they begin to cry out, asking him to heal them. How did they know that if Jesus had been hanging out only up in Galilee the whole time? So there are several of these actually that show that Jesus in fact had been to Jerusalem on multiple occasions. And in any event, it's completely illicit to act like the Gospel of John doesn't exist. And John is quite explicit that Jesus had been in Jerusalem multiple times.
Can I follow up on that just briefly? This is something that I've seen people in New Testament scholarship do multiple times, and it's just a bad move epistemically. It runs like this. You don't have any evidence that Jesus was in Jerusalem until Passion Week. Oh, except that you do have the Gospel of John. And that's evidence that he was in Jerusalem multiple times before Passion Week. Okay, except for the evidence that you don't have any evidence. What? Come on, guys, right? Basic fairness in reading and in thinking about his history should prevent us from trying to pull that kind of stunt with regard to any episode, religiously significant or not. That's just a terrible way to go about reasoning, to say, well, you don't have any evidence except for this evidence. But apart from that evidence, you don't have any other evidence, so I can ignore the evidence that you have. That's awful. If the Synoptic Gospels had said that Jesus did not visit Jerusalem until Passion Week, that would be one thing. But there is a big difference between they don't say that he did and they say that he did not. Those are not equivalent statements. There's a scope difference if you want to talk about it in linguistic terms. It's just a terrible move. And it's an example of what we call the argument from silence. I have a paper on this. I can give you a link, Charles and James or John, if you want. I can send you a link to that paper in Acta Analytica. The argument from silence is a terrible argument in almost every historical connection, and there are lots of cases that are not religious where we can see the argument failing. So this is just a really weak form of argument, and it's even weaker when you're trying to use the silence of one set of documents to undermine the explicit statement of another one. You really should not be doing that in historical work.
Thank you very much, Timothy and Lydia. That was my question. And it's funny you should mention that. That's what I was thinking with respect to the what we know about Pontius Pilate. I believe Bart Ehrman was on Apologia's a video a little while ago responding to Gary Habermas, and what he said was, everything we know about Pontius Pilate is that he would not do this. He had these qualities, and of course, by everything we know about Pilate, he actually means everything we know, excluding the information that's contained within the gospel. So he's excluding the gospels from his evidence base, and it seems like you're using the evidence against the evidence. It just doesn't. I think that's a great point. So
even just from Josephus, though, Pilate was really trying to walk a line. He wanted some Roman shields with the eagles on them with him in Jerusalem. And so he smuggled some in to his private quarters, and the Jews found out about it. Now, this is the Puritan era in Judaism, and as Josephus tells us, the Jews said, graven images in the holy city. This is a violation of the second commandment. You shall have no graven images. And they freaked out, and they sent an embassy to Caesar about it. They said that this is not, we were told we would have religious jurisdiction in our own city. What's going on? And Caesar wrote a tart note to Pilate saying, you take those blankety blank shields and get them out of there. We don't need this mess. And so he took them down to Caesarea Maritima and got them out of there. So even just from Josephus, you see Pilate getting his hands slapped when he tries to do a kind of a private move to get around the Jews. This was not something where he felt he could just blow the Jews away with impunity. Yeah, there were other cases where he was trying to take temple treasury money to build an aqueduct, and they were about to riot, and he had people go out with clubs and beat them. But there was a severe problem with his keeping control. And in this case, just letting the Jews bury some bot, this is not a big deal. And Jesus absolutely would not have been viewed by Pilate as someone who was treasonously setting himself up to be a king after he had said, yeah, I don't have servants who are fighting. My servants aren't of this world. My kingdom isn't of this world. Otherwise, my servants would fight. Oh, all right. Not the kind of king we care about. So the question is just misguided in multiple ways. So, but I appreciate your passing that on from your friend, and that's the answer that I would give.
David,
great. I'll show this to him. Thank you.
David, can you share where you're from? Where you lead your chapter at?
Yes, I'm director in Vancouver, BC.
Nice.
In the least frozen part of the frozen north.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think we've got several time zones. I think the difference between me and Chan on this call is like 15 different time zones. So I want to, as we wrap up this call, Charles, we're going to land this plane on time. That is a miracle. We're talking about miracles today, folks. You guys are witnessing one live in front of you. So I just want to say, if any of you are watching this recording and you've been considering a miracle. It's fascinating. Whenever I am doing a lecture on miracles and I ask people in the room, even of a certain ideological subset, have you experienced a miracle? How many people actually don't raise their hand and say, I don't, of various ages and demographics, and say, I've actually never experienced one. But if you're watching this, and you've been wrestling with miracles, I invite you to really sit with the material that Dr. Tim and the Mcgrews have presented today, and really allow that to impact you. Because the question today is, are miracles something that we should take seriously? And I believe that they've demonstrated very well that miracles are. And then when you log in and see the rest of our videos, or you log into to Lydia's YouTube page and you see the other amazing books and videos that she has, when you begin to see how miracles tie into the full scope of the dialogue, I invite you guys to really see the weight of the things that we discuss here. So if you guys will help me give a hand to Tim and Lydia for such a marvelous presentation. I just thought that was so good. The book that we are talking about is the Blackwell's Companion for Natural Theology. The group that you see here on your screen, we represent an organization named Reasonable Faith under Dr. William Lane Craig. If you have questions about your faith, or you are sitting in church and you're like, how does this relate to the topics of race theory or politics or science or history or philosophy, Reasonable Faith stands alongside the church to show how the Bible is not an enemy to those things. You go on reasonablefaith.org. You go under the link of this video on YouTube, and you'll find great resources to help you out. We look forward to seeing you guys next month as we dive deeper and we round off this book, and then we see what other book takes us a year. But thank you guys again for joining us, and we'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.